I married into a family that never wanted me, and I knew it from day one. But what they did 41 days ago crossed every line I didn't even know existed, and now I'm watching their world fall apart in real time. Let me explain how we got here. I'm Keith, 32, been a carpenter for 14 years. Started as an apprentice at 18, worked my way up, got my contractor's license at 25. I'm good at what I do. I built custom furniture, did renovations, made decent money. Not doctor money, not lawyer money, but I owned my truck outright, had savings, paid my bills on time. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. 3 years ago, I met Samantha at a hardware store. She was trying to figure out which drill bits she needed for some DIY project at her apartment. I helped her pick the right ones. We got to talking. She gave me her Instagram. She was beautiful, funny, seemed down to earth. We started dating, and for 6 months, everything was perfect. She never mentioned her family much, just said they were busy people, that I'd meet them eventually. Then I met Fletcher and Nellie at a restaurant, her parents. The moment I walked up to that table, I could see Fletcher's face change. He looked at my work boots, my Carhartt jacket, my calloused hands. Nellie did this tight smile thing that didn't reach her eyes. The whole dinner was brutal. Fletcher kept asking what my real career plans were, like carpentry was just a phase. Nellie kept mentioning how Samantha's ex-boyfriend from college was finishing his residency. Her brother Eugene showed up halfway through and barely acknowledged me. Spent the whole time on his phone. Samantha defended me that night, told them I was talented, that I ran my own business, that she was happy. I thought maybe things would get better. They didn't. Every family gathering was the same. Fletcher would make comments about blue-collar work. Nellie would sigh dramatically whenever anyone asked about our relationship. Eugene would talk about his finance job and make sure everyone knew his salary. They lived in this massive house in the suburbs, the kind with the circular driveway and the three-car garage. Fletcher ran some kind of consulting firm. I never got the details because he refused to explain it to me in terms I could understand, like I was too stupid to grasp business concepts. But Samantha loved me, or I thought she did. We moved in together after a year, got engaged 6 months later. I saved up and bought her a ring that cost me 3 months of income. Not the biggest diamond, but it was real, and it was mine. Nellie literally laughed when she saw it, asked if it came from a vending machine. Fletcher told Samantha she was making a mistake, that she could do so much better, that carpenter wasn't a real profession. We got married anyway. Small ceremony, mostly my family and friends. Her family showed up late and left early. Fletcher didn't give a speech. Nellie cried through the whole thing, but not the happy kind of crying. Eugene didn't even stay for dinner. But Samantha married me. She said, "I do" in front of everyone. She chose me. The first year of marriage was when things started changing. Samantha began spending more time with her family. Sunday dinners at Fletcher and Nellie's became mandatory. I'd come home from job sites covered in sawdust, and she'd have this look on her face like I was tracking dirt into her space. She started making comments about maybe I should consider going back to school, getting a degree, doing something more professional. I'm not an idiot. I saw what was happening. Her family was in her ear constantly. Every visit to their house included Fletcher pulling her aside for private conversations. Nellie would take her shopping and come back with Samantha looking at me differently. Eugene would text her constantly. I could see the notifications, always links to articles about successful couples or real estate investments or career advice. Then came the house hunting. Samantha wanted to buy a place. I said, sure, let's look at what we can afford together. She showed me listings for homes that cost 3 times our combined income. I explained the math, showed her our budget, tried to be reasonable. She got upset, said I was holding her back, said her parents offered to help with the down payment, but Fletcher wouldn't give us money unless it was the right kind of house in the right neighborhood. I told her we didn't need their money. I could build us a house if she wanted. I had the skills, I had contractor connections, we could find land and do it right. She looked at me like I'd suggested we live in a tent, told me that wasn't the same thing, that she grew up in a certain lifestyle and she wanted that for our family. Our family. That's when she dropped it that she was thinking about kids soon, that her parents were pushing for grandchildren, that Fletcher had made comments about hoping the kids would inherit Samantha's intelligence and not my work ethic. Like my work ethic was somehow inferior because I worked with my hands instead of behind a desk. I started noticing other things. Samantha would change clothes before we went to her family's house, make me change too. She bought me button-down shirts and khakis, said I needed to look more presentable. She'd check my hands before we left, make sure there was no grease under my nails. She stopped telling her friends what I did for a living, started just saying I was in construction, making it sound bigger than it was. 6 months ago, Fletcher offered me a job. Said his firm needed someone to handle facility management, dealing with building maintenance, contractor negotiations. Said it paid $60,000 a year plus benefits. I knew what he was doing. He wanted to control me, wanted to pull me away from my business, wanted me dependent on him. I said no thanks. Fletcher didn't take it well. Told Samantha I was being ungrateful, that I didn't understand opportunity when it was handed to me. Samantha begged me to reconsider. We had our first real fight about it. She said I was being stubborn, that I was putting my pride before our future. I told her I built my business from nothing and I wasn't giving it up to be Fletcher's maintenance guy. She cried, said I didn't love her enough to compromise, said her father was just trying to help. That's when Eugene got involved. Started calling me, texting me, saying I needed to think about what was best for his sister. That Samantha deserved stability, deserved someone who could provide properly. I told him to mind his own business. He showed up at one of my job sites, just appeared while I was working on a kitchen renovation, stood there in his suit watching me work, told me I was embarrassing the family. The family. Like I was part of it. Like they ever let me be part of it. 3 months ago, things escalated. Samantha started therapy. She told me it was for stress, but I found out from her Instagram that Nellie was going with her to sessions. Family therapy, except I wasn't invited. Samantha would come home from these appointments and start fights about nothing. About dishes in the sink, about my work schedule, about how I never wanted to do anything social with her family. I tried. I really did try. I showed up to every dinner. I smiled through Fletcher's insults. I ignored Nellie's passive-aggressive comments about Samantha's friends who married doctors and lawyers. I let Eugene talk down to me like I was uneducated trash. I did it all because I loved my wife. But then Samantha started talking about the intervention. She kept saying her family was worried about us, that they wanted to help us work through our issues. I asked what issues. She couldn't give me a straight answer, just kept saying that maybe we needed outside perspective, that her family loved us and wanted us to be happy. I knew something was wrong, the way she said it, the way she wouldn't look at me. I asked her directly if her family was planning something. She denied it, swore up and down that it was just concern, just love, just wanting the best for us. Last week, she told me we were invited to a family gathering, said it was just dinner, that everyone would be there, that it would be nice to see everyone together. Eugene would be there with his wife, Fletcher and Nellie, obviously. Some aunts and uncles I'd only met once or twice. Casual, she said. Just family time. I knew it wasn't just dinner, but I went anyway because I wanted to see what they were planning. I wanted to look them in the eyes when they finally showed me who they really were. And 36 days ago, they did exactly that. Update 1. Okay, so I got a lot of messages asking what happened at the gathering. Some of you figured it out from the title. Yeah, it was bad. Worse than I expected, and I expected it to be bad. But here's the thing that everyone needs to understand. I knew something was coming. I'd spent 3 years watching these people chip away at my marriage, at my wife, at everything I built. So when I walked into Fletcher and Nellie's house that night, I wasn't some clueless victim walking into an ambush. I was ready. The house was full when we arrived. Not just Fletcher, Nellie, and Eugene. There were aunts and uncles I barely knew. Cousins Samantha mentioned maybe twice. Eugene's wife, Daisy, who usually avoided family functions. Everyone was dressed up, sitting in the living room like they were waiting for a show to start. The furniture had been rearranged, chairs in a circle. One empty seat, clearly meant for me. Samantha squeezed my hand when we walked in. I remember that detail specifically because it was the last time she touched me with anything resembling affection. Fletcher stood up and did this whole welcome speech about how they were all there because they loved Samantha and wanted what was best for her. How family takes care of family. How sometimes tough conversations need to happen. I sat down in that empty chair and looked around at all of them. Nellie had her phone out. I could see she was recording. Eugene was leaning forward with this smirk on his face. And that's when Fletcher started in on me. He said they'd been patient for 3 years, that they'd given me chances to prove myself, to become someone worthy of their daughter, that I'd failed at every opportunity. He went through a list, and I mean an actual list he had written down. Times I'd shown up to family events in work clothes, jobs I'd taken that required weekend work, the fact that I refused his job offer, my lack of college education, my truck that was 8 years old, the size of Samantha's engagement ring, the neighborhood we lived in, everything. Nellie jumped in talking about how Samantha could have married so many other men, better men, men with futures and prospects. She pulled out her phone and started showing pictures of Samantha's ex-boyfriends, the resident, the lawyer, some guy who worked in tech in California. She went through each one talking about what they were doing now, what they were earning, where they lived. Eugene added that I was basically a leech, that Samantha was supporting my lifestyle, that I was holding her back from her potential. He had spreadsheets, actual printed spreadsheets comparing my income to the average income of men in Samantha's social circle, comparing the value of our apartment to where her friends lived. He'd calculated how much Samantha's quality of life had decreased since marrying me. The aunts and uncles started chiming in with their opinions. One uncle talked about how embarrassing it was to tell people at his country club that his niece married a carpenter. An aunt mentioned how she had to explain to her friends that Samantha made a mistake but was working on fixing it. Another cousin brought up how this was affecting the family's reputation. And Samantha sat there, right next to me on a separate chair. She didn't say anything, didn't defend me, didn't tell them to stop. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Fletcher stood up and walked over to me, got right in my face, told me I was dirt under Samantha's shoes, that I would always be dirt, that I could work my entire life and never be good enough for their family, that my children, if we had them, would be ashamed of their father, that Samantha was embarrassed to be married to me. I asked Samantha directly if that was true, if she was embarrassed. She looked at her father, then at her mother, then finally at me. She said she thought maybe we'd rushed into marriage, that maybe she wasn't ready, that maybe her family had valid concerns about our compatibility. Compatibility. Like the problem was that we didn't match, not that her family had spent 3 years systematically destroying her feelings for me. That's when Eugene and his wife got up. Eugene grabbed my collar, yanked me up from the chair. Daisy was holding a folder with our wedding photos, the ones we'd had printed and framed. They'd taken them from our apartment somehow. I didn't even know they were missing. Eugene held me while Daisy took scissors and cut through every single photo. Through my face, through Samantha's dress, through the images of us at the altar. Fletcher stood there watching, and then he spit in my face. Actually spit on me. In front of his entire family, told me I was nothing, that I would always be nothing. Nellie was still recording everything on her phone. She was laughing. Actually, laughing hysterically while her husband spit on me and her son held me down. She said something about how this would be a funny story to tell at Samantha's next wedding. Her real wedding, to someone appropriate. Eugene let me go and Fletcher pulled out an envelope. Divorce papers, already drawn up by their family attorney, pre-signed by Samantha. He dropped them on the floor at my feet and told me to sign them and get out of their lives. I picked up those papers, folded them carefully, put them in my jacket pocket, looked at Fletcher, at Nellie, at Eugene, at every single face in that room, and I said thank you. Thank you for showing me exactly who you are. Thank you for making this crystal clear. Samantha finally looked up at me, asked where I was going. I told her I was leaving through the front door with my head up, which is more dignity than anyone in this room had. Then I walked out. I drove straight to my parents' house. They live about 40 minutes away, small place, nothing fancy. My dad's a retired electrician. Mom worked as a school secretary for 30 years. They knew things with Samantha's family were bad, but I'd never told them the full extent. I laid it all out that night. Everything. My dad didn't say much, just listened. My mom cried. Not for me, she told me later, but because she'd raised me to believe that hard work and integrity mattered, and seeing how Fletcher's family treated those values made her angry. She said something I'll never forget, that people who measure worth in dollar signs have no idea what value actually means. I stayed there that night. Didn't sleep much, kept thinking about Samantha's face, how she'd watched everything happen, how she'd signed divorce papers before even talking to me about it, how she'd brought me to that house knowing exactly what was planned. My phone started blowing up around midnight. Samantha calling, texting. Her messages were all over the place, saying she was sorry, that things got out of hand, that her family went too far. Then the next message would be her saying maybe they had some points, that we did have problems, that maybe separation was best. Then back to apologizing, then back to defending them. I didn't respond. Not that night. The next day, I went back to our apartment when I knew she'd be at work. Packed my tools, my clothes, my personal stuff, left my keys on the counter. I took photos of everything, where things were, what belonged to me versus what was hers or her family's gifts. I wanted documentation of what I was taking so they couldn't accuse me of theft later. Called my landlord from my parents' place, explained the situation, asked what my options were. The lease was in both our names, but I'd been paying my half every month, had proof of that. Samantha came home while I was finishing up packing, started crying, asking why I was doing this. I asked her if she'd known about the intervention ahead of time. She admitted she had. Said her family convinced her it was necessary, that they needed to make me understand how serious the situation was, that they thought if I saw how everyone felt, I'd be motivated to change. Change. They wanted me to change who I was. Stop being a carpenter, stop running my business, become whatever they decided was acceptable. I told her she'd stood there and watched her father spit on me. She said he was out of line, that she didn't expect it to go that far. But she also said maybe I should consider that so many people couldn't be wrong, that if her entire family saw problems, maybe the problems were real. I asked her about the divorce papers. She said her dad had them drawn up just in case, that she signed them because she thought maybe having them ready would push me to take things seriously. She swore she didn't actually want a divorce, that this was all supposed to be a wake-up call for me. A wake-up call. By spitting on me and cutting up our wedding photos. I told her I'd be staying with my parents while I figured things out. She begged me not to go. Said we could work through this, go to counseling, fix things. I asked her if she'd go to counseling without her mother. She didn't answer. That's when Eugene showed up at the apartment. Said Samantha called him crying. That he was there to make sure I wasn't harassing her. I pointed out that it was my apartment too. That I was just getting my things. He said not for long, that Fletcher's attorney would be handling the divorce and I should get my own lawyer if I could afford one. The way he said it, if I could afford one, like I was some charity case. I left before I did something I'd regret. Drove back to my parents' house with my truck full of tools and clothes and the remains of 3 years of marriage. My phone kept buzzing. Samantha, Eugene, even Nellie sent me a Facebook message saying I was being dramatic and should come back to talk like an adult. Fletcher sent a text through Samantha's phone telling me the divorce papers needed to be signed within 30 days or his attorney would pursue other options. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I called my own attorney, someone I'd worked with on business contracts, who I trusted, explained the situation, asked about my rights, my options, asked specifically about what had happened at Fletcher's house, whether any of it constituted harassment or assault. My attorney said the divorce would be straightforward since we'd only been married 2 years and had no kids or shared assets beyond the apartment lease. Said the intervention itself wasn't illegal even though it was messed up. But she also said something interesting. She asked if Fletcher's business was tied to any of his family's personal property and whether Samantha had any legal ownership in anything related to her parents. I didn't know the answers then, but I started finding out. See, here's what Fletcher and Nellie didn't know about me. I'm good at my job not just because I can build things, but because I understand how things connect, how structures work, how to find the weak points, how to read plans and see where the problems are before they become disasters. And I started looking at their family structure the same way, finding the connections, the weak points, the places where everything relied on one support beam. My buddy from high school works in property records at the county office. I asked him some hypothetical questions about how property ownership works, how business registrations work, how you'd find out who really owns what. All public information, all legal to access. Another friend who does financial planning mentioned over beers that the suburbs where Fletcher lives just passed new zoning regulations. That a lot of people who'd been bending rules on home businesses or property uses were getting violation notices. I spent 2 weeks asking questions, making calls, learning things, not doing anything yet, just learning. Samantha kept texting. Her messages got more desperate. She showed up at my parents' house twice. My mom answered the door both times, told her I wasn't ready to talk. Samantha told my mom that I was being unreasonable, that every family has disagreements, that her family just wanted the best for us. My mom asked her if her family thought spitting on people was wanting the best for them. Samantha left. Eugene sent me a Facebook message saying I had 1 week to sign the papers or Fletcher would make things difficult for me, would start telling people in the contracting community that I was unreliable, that I'd left his daughter hanging, that I couldn't be trusted with family homes. That message was a mistake on Eugene's part, because it told me exactly how they planned to hurt me, through my reputation, through my business, which meant that's where they were vulnerable too. Fletcher's consulting firm worked with a lot of local businesses. I'd heard him mention clients at family dinners, big names, companies everyone in the area knew. His reputation was everything to him. The respect, the country club membership, the image of success. I started making a list. Every weakness, every pressure point, every place where the foundation was weaker than it looked. And I waited. Because revenge isn't about acting fast. It's about acting right. Samantha filed for divorce officially 3 weeks after the intervention. Her attorney sent paperwork to mine. Standard stuff, splitting the apartment deposit, dividing what little shared property we had. She wanted it done quick and quiet. I signed the papers. Let her think this was over. Let Fletcher think he'd won. Let Eugene think his threats worked. But I kept my list. And I kept making calls. And I kept finding connections. Yesterday, 35 days after they spit on me and cut up my wedding photos, I made my first move. And today, I'm watching their confidence start to crack. Update 2. Alright, so a lot of you have been asking what my first move was. Some of you guessed it had something to do with Fletcher's business or their house. You're partially right, but it's more complicated than that, and honestly more satisfying because everything I'm doing is completely legal and just exposing what was already there. Let me back up to what I learned during those 2 weeks of research. Fletcher's consulting firm operates out of his house. That massive house with the circular driveway? It's zoned residential, but he's been running a full business out of a converted garage office for years, meeting clients there, having his assistant come by, the whole setup. Technically, that requires commercial zoning, or at minimum, a home occupation permit with specific restrictions. The county where they live just cracked down on this stuff. New regulations, enforcement team going through neighborhoods checking for violations. I didn't report Fletcher, I didn't have to. I just made sure the enforcement team knew which neighborhoods to prioritize by mentioning at the planning office that I was considering buying property in that area and wanted to know about business activity regulations, public information, public process. Completely legal. But here's where it gets interesting. Fletcher's business license lists his office address as a commercial space downtown, but his actual operations, his client meetings, his staff meetings, all at the house, which means he's been claiming one address for tax purposes while operating from another. Not illegal necessarily, but it raises questions. Questions that get asked when someone requests public records about business registrations and compares them to county violation notices. I made those requests, paid the small processing fees, got the documentation. Then I started talking to people, not spreading rumors, not lying, just talking, asking questions, mentioning facts. I ran into one of Fletcher's former clients at a lumber yard. Guy was having a deck built. I'd worked with him on another project 2 years ago. We got to talking about contractors, about people who cut corners. I mentioned I'd learned the hard way that sometimes people who seem successful are just good at looking the part. Mentioned how I'd seen someone operate a business out of residential property while claiming a different address. Didn't name Fletcher, didn't have to. This guy knew I'd married into that family. He put it together himself. He asked me directly if I was talking about my father-in-law. I said I couldn't comment on family matters, but public records were available to anyone who wanted to look. 3 days later, Fletcher lost that client, a contract worth $40,000 over 6 months. The client told him he'd decided to go with a firm that had more transparent business practices. Fletcher called me. Finally. First time I'd heard his voice since he spit on me. He was angry but trying to sound reasonable. Asked what I'd said to his client. I told him I hadn't said anything untrue, that I'd just had a conversation about public records and business practices. He said I was jeopardizing his livelihood over hurt feelings. Hurt feelings. Like watching your wife's father spit on you is just hurt feelings. I told Fletcher that reputations are built on perception, and sometimes perception changes when people learn new information. He said I was making a mistake, that his family had connections, that I was a carpenter who could be replaced, but he had relationships with contractors and builders all over the area. I reminded him that I'd been working in this area for 14 years, that I knew a lot of people. That word travels fast in the contracting world, and people talk. That maybe he should consider how his own reputation was built on looking successful rather than being ethical. He hung up on me, but he knew I wasn't backing down. Nellie started calling next. Left voicemails saying I was being vindictive, that I was hurting Samantha by attacking her family, that the divorce should be finalized and we should all move on. She sent me Facebook messages saying I was immature and petty. I didn't respond to any of it, just kept making my public records requests, kept having conversations with people in my industry, kept mentioning facts. Eugene tried a different approach. He showed up at my parents' house. My dad answered the door, told him I wasn't there. Eugene said he needed to talk to me man to man, that this situation was getting out of control. My dad told him that spitting on someone and cutting up their wedding photos was out of control, and showing up at someone's parents' house uninvited wasn't helping his case. Eugene said his father was just being protective of his daughter, that I should understand family loyalty. My dad asked him if family loyalty included recording humiliation for entertainment. Eugene left, but not before saying I'd regret continuing down this path. The thing is, I wasn't done. Not even close. Remember how I mentioned Fletcher lives in that huge house? I started looking into the property records. That house is expensive, really expensive. The mortgage is substantial. And Fletcher's business, while it looks successful, operates on those $40,000 contracts he was losing. I didn't have to do much. Once one client started questioning Fletcher's business practices, others started asking questions too. Word spreads in professional circles. People talk at networking events, at country club lunches, at golf courses. When one person pulls a contract, others get curious about why. Fletcher lost 2 more clients in the next week. Both cited concerns about business transparency and ethical practices. Both mentioned they'd heard things that made them uncomfortable. I never spoke to either of them directly. Eugene started posting on Facebook about unfair business practices and false rumors. Didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew what he meant. He wrote this long post about how small-minded people try to tear down successful families, how jealousy makes people vindictive. The post backfired. People in the comments started asking questions. What rumors? What happened? Someone who'd been at the intervention, one of the cousins, commented something vague about family drama. Another relative mentioned the divorce. Someone else brought up that I was a carpenter who worked hard and didn't deserve the treatment I'd gotten. Nellie deleted Eugene's post, but screenshots had already circulated. People were talking. The family's image of perfection was cracking. Samantha started texting me multiple times a day. She'd gone from apologetic to angry to desperate. She said I was destroying her family over nothing, that her dad's business problems weren't my fault, but I wasn't helping, that I should be the bigger person and stop whatever I was doing. I called her. First time I'd actually talked to her since I left the apartment. Asked her what exactly she thought I was doing. She said I was spreading lies about her father, turning his clients against him, ruining his reputation. I asked her what lies specifically. She couldn't name one. I asked her if anything I'd mentioned about zoning violations or business registration discrepancies was untrue. She said that wasn't the point, that I knew what I was doing. I told her the point was that her family spent 3 years treating me like garbage, culminated it with a public humiliation, and now they were facing consequences for their own choices. That I hadn't made Fletcher operate a business out of residential property. I hadn't made him claim one address while working from another. I didn't make him vulnerable to losing clients when his practices came under scrutiny. She said I was being cruel, that I was supposed to love her, that married people don't do this to each other. I reminded her we were divorced, that she'd signed papers before even talking to me about problems, that she'd watched her father spit on me and done nothing. She started crying, said her family was just protective, that they wanted the best for her, that maybe they went too far but they meant well, that I was taking revenge too far, that I was hurting innocent people. I asked her who the innocent people were. Her father who violated zoning regulations? Her mother who recorded my humiliation while laughing? Her brother who held me down while they cut our photos? She said I was twisting everything, that I was making them sound worse than they were, that families have conflicts but you don't destroy people over it. I told her I wasn't destroying anyone. I was just letting the truth be visible, that if her father's business couldn't survive basic scrutiny, that wasn't my fault. She hung up, but she kept texting, begging me to stop, saying her parents were panicking, that Eugene was talking about taking legal action against me for defamation. I called my attorney, asked about defamation law, what constitutes libel, what my protections were. She told me that truth is an absolute defense against defamation, that if everything I'd said was factual and based on public records, I had nothing to worry about. She also mentioned something else, asked if I knew that Nellie co-signed Fletcher's business loans, that if his business failed or faced financial trouble, their personal assets were on the line, including the house. I hadn't known that, but it explained why Nellie was so frantic, why Eugene was threatening legal action. They weren't just protecting Fletcher's business, they were protecting their entire financial foundation. I started looking into what other pressure points existed. Found out Eugene's wife Daisy worked for a nonprofit that valued family-friendly image. Found out Nellie volunteered extensively at their church, held a position on several social committees. Found out the country club Fletcher belonged to had ethics requirements for membership. I wasn't planning to go after all of them, but I wanted to know where the weak spots were, where one push could create a cascade. Then Fletcher made everything worse for himself. He went to some of his remaining clients and told them I was a disgruntled ex-son-in-law, spreading lies because of a divorce. Tried to paint me as unstable and vindictive. 2 of those clients reached out to me directly, asked for my side. I told them the truth, showed them the public records I'd accessed, explained the discrepancies I'd noticed, mentioned that everything I'd said was verifiable through county offices. One of those clients pulled their contract immediately. The other reduced their scope of work by half. Fletcher's revenue was tanking, and it was all his own doing, his own choices, his own violations coming home. Eugene sent me a message through Instagram, said his father was considering suing me for tortious interference with business relationships, that I'd crossed a line from personal grievance to illegal action. I forwarded the message to my attorney. She laughed, said that telling the truth about public information isn't illegal, that Fletcher would have a hard time proving I'd interfered with anything when his own business practices created the problem. She also said that if Fletcher did sue, it would open him up to discovery, that we'd be able to request documentation about his business operations, his tax filings, his client relationships, that depositions would be taken, that everything would become even more public. I sent Eugene a response, told him to have Fletcher's attorney contact mine if he wanted to pursue legal action, that I welcome the opportunity to discuss everything in a formal legal setting with full documentation. Eugene didn't respond, but Samantha called within an hour, absolutely frantic. Said her father couldn't afford a lawsuit, couldn't afford any more public scrutiny, begged me to just stop, to let it go, to move on with my life. I asked her why I should. She said because it was the right thing to do. Because despite everything, we'd been married. We'd meant something to each other. I told her we'd meant something to me. Past tense. That she'd thrown that away when she brought me to that intervention knowing what would happen. That her family had made their choice, and now they were living with consequences. She said I was being heartless. That the Keith she married wouldn't do this. I told her the Keith she married wouldn't have been spit on and humiliated in front of her entire family while she watched silently. That people change when you show them who you really are. My mom had been listening to some of this. I was at my parents' house when Samantha called. After I hung up, my mom asked if I was okay, if this was really what I wanted to be doing. I told her honestly that I didn't enjoy it, that I wished none of it had happened, but that I'd spent 3 years being treated as less than, being told I wasn't good enough, being systematically broken down, that the intervention wasn't a surprise, it was just the culmination of everything they'd done to me, that they needed to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people like dirt and expect them to quietly disappear. My dad added that Fletcher's problems were Fletcher's creation, that if his business was built on shortcuts and image rather than substance, it deserved to fail, that I wasn't obligated to protect someone who tried to destroy me. Yesterday, 39 days after the intervention, I got a call from an unknown number. Answered it out of curiosity. It was Fletcher. He sounded different, tired. He asked if we could meet somewhere to talk. Said he wanted to discuss this situation like adults. I agreed. Told him to meet me at the hardware store parking lot where I'd first met Samantha. Felt appropriate somehow. We met this morning. Fletcher showed up in a different car, a sedan instead of his usual luxury vehicle. He looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. He started by saying we'd gotten off on the wrong foot years ago, that maybe he'd been too harsh, too protective, that he recognized I was skilled at my work, that I'd built something for myself. I didn't say anything, just let him talk. He said his business was struggling, that he'd lost several major contracts, that questions were being raised about his practices, that he knew I was behind some of it. I told him I hadn't done anything except tell the truth and answer questions honestly. He said the truth can be weaponized, that I knew what I was doing when I talked to people in the industry, that I was deliberately sabotaging him. I asked him what he expected. Did he think he could spit on me, have his son hold me down while they cut my wedding photos, record the whole thing laughing, and then I'd just accept it and move on? He said that was a family matter, that it got emotional, that things were said and done in the heat of the moment that shouldn't have happened. I asked him if he was apologizing. He said he was acknowledging that perhaps they'd been too forceful in expressing their concerns. Too forceful. Not wrong. Not cruel. Too forceful. I told him that wasn't good enough, that actions have consequences, that he'd spent 3 years trying to destroy my marriage and then humiliated me in front of his entire family, that if his business couldn't survive basic scrutiny of his practices, that was his fault, not mine. He said I didn't understand the financial pressure he was under, that losing these contracts meant he might lose the house, might have to close the business, that Nellie was having panic attacks, that Eugene was worried about family reputation affecting his own career. I told him I understood perfectly. That's what happens when your foundation is built on image instead of substance. He asked what I wanted, what would make me stop, and that's when I realized I had him. When I understood that the control had shifted completely, I told him I'd think about it, that I'd let him know what came next. He tried to argue, but I walked back to my truck and drove away. Tonight, 40 days after they tried to break me, I'm planning my next move. And Samantha just sent me a message saying her mother is crying constantly. Her father is drinking more than usual, and Eugene is talking about the family losing everything. They wanted me to understand my place, wanted me to know I was beneath them. Now they're learning what happens when you underestimate someone. Final update. It's been 41 days since Fletcher spit on me and his family, cut up my wedding photos while Samantha watched. Today, their world finished collapsing. Let me tell you how it happened. After that meeting with Fletcher in the hardware store parking lot, I went home and made a list of every single person in the contracting and business community who'd ever mentioned working with him. Not to spread lies, not to sabotage directly, just to have conversations. I reached out to a contractor I'd worked with on several projects, guy who did high-end residential work. We met at a diner for breakfast, talked about business, about the challenges of maintaining reputation in this industry. I mentioned I'd recently gone through a divorce, that I'd learned some hard lessons about people who prioritize image over substance. He asked if I was talking about my ex-in-laws. I showed him the public records I'd pulled, the zoning violations, the business registration discrepancies, the complaints filed with the county, all public information, all factual. He thanked me for the heads up, said he'd been considering hiring Fletcher's firm for some consulting work but would reconsider. That contract would have been worth $60,000. Fletcher needed it badly after losing the others. Then I talked to the guy who handled commercial property management for several office buildings in the area. He'd mentioned Fletcher at a job site months ago, said he was considering moving his company's consulting contract. I asked him if he'd verified Fletcher's business credentials, checked his actual operation setup, suggested he might want to do due diligence given recent county enforcement actions in residential areas. He did his own research, pulled out of preliminary discussions with Fletcher completely. Eugene tried to do damage control, started calling people Fletcher had worked with, trying to explain that the zoning issues were being resolved, that everything was legitimate. But every time he called someone, they'd ask more questions. Why was the business operating from a residential address? Why were the tax filings showing one location while clients met at another? Why hadn't these issues been disclosed earlier? Eugene made it worse by getting defensive, by accusing people of believing lies from a vindictive ex-son-in-law. People don't like being told they're gullible. They started asking harder questions. Daisy, Eugene's wife, called me. First time she'd ever contacted me directly. She wanted to know what was happening, why Eugene was so stressed, why the family was in crisis. I asked her if she'd been at the intervention. She admitted she had. I asked her if she thought cutting up someone's wedding photos while their father-in-law spit on them was appropriate family behavior. She got quiet, said she'd felt uncomfortable that night but didn't think it was her place to intervene, that Fletcher and Nellie were upset and emotional. I told her that discomfort should have turned into action, that watching abuse happen and doing nothing makes you complicit. I sent her the video Nellie had recorded that night. Someone at the intervention had sent it to me through Facebook, a cousin who felt guilty. I told Daisy to watch it and then decide if she wanted to defend this family. She watched it, called me back 3 hours later crying, said she didn't know it had been that bad, that the way Fletcher grabbed me and the things he said were worse than she remembered. She asked what she could do. I told her to stop helping Eugene protect Fletcher's business, to stop covering for them socially, to tell the truth when people asked questions. She did. Eugene lost his mind when he found out Daisy had talked to me, that she'd watched the video, that she was refusing to keep making excuses for the family. They had a massive fight. I know because Samantha told me about it. Said Eugene blamed me for destroying his marriage too. Not my fault his wife finally saw who his family really was. Fletcher lost another major client 3 days ago. This one was different because the client didn't just pull their contract. They asked for documentation of work completed to date, questioned billing practices, demanded proof that services rendered matched invoices submitted. Fletcher couldn't provide clean documentation because his record-keeping was sloppy, mixed personal and business expenses, had gaps in the timeline. The client threatened to sue for overcharging. Fletcher's attorney told him to settle, pay back $15,000 to avoid litigation and further scrutiny. Fletcher didn't have $15,000 liquid because his revenue had dropped 70% in 5 weeks. He had to pull money from his personal savings, the savings that were supposed to cover the mortgage while business was down. Nellie started calling me directly after that, left voicemails saying I'd made my point, that I'd punished them enough, that I needed to stop before the family lost everything. She sent text messages talking about how Fletcher had health problems, how the stress was affecting him, how I was being vindictive beyond reason. I didn't respond to her directly. Instead, I called her pastor, the one from the church where she volunteered, where she sat on the fellowship committee and organized charity events. I asked to speak with him about a personal matter involving one of his congregation members. We met at the church, in his office. I showed him the video of the intervention, told him this was the woman who held a leadership position in his church community, who claimed to represent Christian values. Asked him if this behavior aligned with the principles he taught. He was horrified, said he'd speak with Nellie, that this behavior was unacceptable regardless of family conflict, that leadership positions came with expectations of conduct. Nellie was asked to step down from the fellowship committee, lost her volunteer leadership role. Word spread through the church community because these things always spread. Her social standing, the one she'd built over decades, took a hit. She called me screaming, said I was destroying her life, that I'd turned her church against her, that this was beyond revenge into cruelty. that what happened at the intervention was private family business. I told her she'd recorded it on video and laughed while her husband spit on me, that she'd lost the right to call anything private when she documented my humiliation for entertainment, that actions have consequences, and she was finally experiencing hers. The country club called Fletcher, asking him to come in for a meeting with the membership committee. Someone had raised concerns about his business practices, about the complaints filed against him, about his conduct in personal matters. Country club memberships aren't just about money, they're about reputation, about maintaining standards. Fletcher went to that meeting yesterday, came back, and immediately started drinking. Samantha called me afterward, begging me to stop. Said her father was talking about losing everything, about having to sell the house, about his reputation being destroyed. I asked her where she was when her father was destroying mine. She said that was different, that I was working class and didn't have as much to lose, that Fletcher had built his business over 30 years, and I was taking it apart in weeks. I told her that proved she never valued me at all, that in her mind, my dignity and self-respect mattered less because I worked with my hands instead of behind a desk, that she'd just admitted what I always knew. She agreed with her family's assessment of me. She backtracked, said she didn't mean it that way, said she was scared and stressed, that her parents might lose the house, that her father's business was failing, that Eugene and Daisy were fighting constantly, that the whole family was falling apart. I told her the family fell apart when they decided humiliating me was acceptable, that they'd made choices and now they were living with consequences. She asked what I wanted from her, what would make me stop. I said I wanted her to admit the truth, to say out loud that she'd brought me to that intervention knowing what would happen, that she'd signed divorce papers before talking to me, that she'd watched her father spit on me and done nothing because deep down, she agreed I wasn't good enough for her family. She tried to deny it, said it wasn't that simple, that she'd been confused and pressured, that she loved me but her family made her doubt everything. I told her to prove it, tell her family they were wrong, defend me publicly the way she should have 41 days ago, make it right. She said she couldn't, that it would destroy her relationship with her parents, that she'd lose her family. I told her she'd already lost me, and that apparently her family's approval mattered more than her marriage ever did. She cried, said I was being unfair, that I was asking her to choose. I told her she'd already chosen 41 days ago when she stood silently and watched. This morning, Fletcher's business accounts effectively froze. Not literally frozen by banks, but frozen in the sense that his remaining clients all put their payments on hold pending resolution of the complaints against him. 3 clients simultaneously demanding documentation, questioning charges, threatening legal action if discrepancies weren't explained. Eugene called me directly, said his father was having a breakdown, that Nellie was having panic attacks, that they might lose the house within months if Fletcher couldn't resolve the business issues. He asked what it would take for me to back off. I told him to meet me. Same hardware store parking lot where I'd met Samantha 3 years ago, where I'd met Fletcher weeks ago. Full circle. Eugene showed up looking rough, hadn't shaved, clothes wrinkled, none of his usual polished appearance. He started by saying his family had made mistakes but that I was taking revenge too far, that people were suffering, that his father was drinking heavily, that his mother was medicated for anxiety, that his own marriage was strained because Daisy refused to support the family anymore. I asked him if he remembered holding me down while they cut my wedding photos. He said that was different, that was in the moment, that tensions were high. I asked him if he'd apologized for it. He said he didn't think he needed to, that I should understand it was just frustration boiling over. Just frustration. Holding someone down while your father spits on them is just frustration. I told him I understood perfectly. I understood that his family believed they were better than me, that they could treat me however they wanted without consequences, that they'd spent 3 years breaking down my marriage and then humiliated me when I wouldn't just disappear quietly. He said that wasn't fair, that they'd just wanted what was best for Samantha. I asked him if destroying someone's dignity was best for anyone. If teaching Samantha that love meant letting your family abuse your spouse was a good lesson. He didn't have an answer. Said I was twisting things, making them sound worse than they were. I pulled out my phone, showed him the video of the intervention that Nellie had recorded, made him watch the whole thing, watched his face as he saw his father grab my collar, spit on me, saw himself holding me down, saw the whole family standing around watching like it was entertainment. He looked sick by the end, said he didn't remember it being that bad. I told him that's because he didn't care, that when you don't see someone as fully human, when you think they're beneath you, their pain doesn't register. He asked what I wanted. What would end this? I told him I wanted them to understand that being working class doesn't make someone less valuable. That carpentry is honest work. That respect isn't determined by tax brackets or job titles. That they'd tried to break me and failed. And now they were dealing with the consequences of their own actions and choices. That every client Fletcher lost was because of his own business practices. Every friend Nellie lost was because of her own behavior. Every problem in Eugene's marriage was because he'd chosen to participate in cruelty. That I hadn't destroyed their family. They'd destroyed themselves by believing their money and status put them above basic human decency. Eugene left without another word. Samantha showed up at my parents' house tonight. My mom answered the door, told her I didn't want to see her. Samantha pushed past and found me in the garage, where I was working on a custom bookshelf for a client. She looked terrible, eyes red from crying, hair messy, wearing sweatpants and an old college shirt. She said her parents were talking about bankruptcy, that Fletcher's business was effectively dead, that they'd have to sell the house, that Nellie was devastated, that Eugene was barely speaking to any of them, that this was all my fault, that I'd taken revenge too far, that whatever they'd done, it didn't justify destroying their entire lives. I put down my tools, looked at her directly, asked her if she remembered the intervention. She said of course she did. I asked her what she remembered most clearly. She said she remembered me leaving. I told her I remembered her standing there silently while her father spit on me, that I remembered her smiling slightly when Eugene grabbed me, that I remembered her watching them cut our wedding photos and doing absolutely nothing. She said she was in shock, that she didn't know how to react. I told her she'd had 3 years to react, 3 years of watching her family tear me down, 3 years of choosing them over me in 1,000 small ways, that the intervention was just the culmination, the moment when all the quiet cruelty became loud and visible. She said she'd made mistakes, but she loved me, that we could fix things if I'd just stop, if I'd let her family recover. I asked her if she thought love meant watching someone be humiliated and doing nothing, if she thought marriage meant bringing your spouse to an ambush, if she thought I'd ever trust her again after she signed divorce papers without talking to me. She said she panicked, that her family convinced her it was necessary. I told her she was an adult who made choices, that she chose her family's approval over her marriage, over me, over basic human decency, that I'd spent 41 days making sure her family understood what it felt like to be torn down, to watch everything they built crumble, to be helpless while people they trusted destroyed them. She asked if I was satisfied now, if watching her family suffer was enough. I told her satisfaction wasn't the point. The point was consequences. The point was that you can't treat people like they're worthless and expect no repercussions. She left crying. My mom came into the garage after and asked if I was okay. I told her honestly that I wasn't happy about any of this, that I wished Samantha's family had just accepted me, or at least treated me with basic respect, that I wished the intervention had never happened, but that since it did happen, since they made their choices, they needed to live with the results. My dad said something that stuck with me. He said that Fletcher and Nellie had spent 30 years building a life based on appearances, on status, on looking down at people they considered beneath them, that a foundation that weak was always going to collapse eventually. I'd just been the one to expose the cracks. So here we are, 41 days after they tried to break me. Fletcher's business is in ruins. Not because I sabotaged it, but because his own practices couldn't withstand basic scrutiny. Nellie's social standing is destroyed because people saw who she really was. Eugene's marriage is strained because his wife finally understood what his family values. Samantha lost her husband because she chose her family's approval over her marriage. And me? I'm still a carpenter, still running my business, still taking pride in my work, still building things with my hands. The difference is now, everyone knows that being working class doesn't mean being weak, doesn't mean accepting abuse, doesn't mean you can be spit on and humiliated without consequences. Fletcher tried to teach me my place. Instead, I taught him that respect isn't about money or status or job titles. It's about basic human decency, and when you don't have that, everything else eventually falls apart. Their daughter married beneath her, they said. A carpenter wasn't good enough for their family. Turns out, I was too good for them. They just never realized it until it was too late.